So hang on, before rushing in to start our first Nessus scan, I'd like to show you how to create our own policies. Policies allow you to create custom templates defining what actions are performed during a scan. In the Nessus web interface, click Policies at the left side. You see that? Good. Click the Create a New Policy link inside the Policies page. Now here we have a lot of scanners. So in Advanced Scan, all the options are chosen by us without any guidance or recommendations. Basic Network Scan is generally suitable for any host. Internal PCI Network Scan is designed for internal scans, and it's based on PCI DSS standards. PCI DSS, Payment Card Institute, and Data Security Standards, simply one of the most important information security standards. So it looks like the days when this video was captured that Spectre and Meltdown are really new vulnerabilities. So here there is a scan specialized for Spectre and Meltdown vulnerabilities. This clearly shows how up-to-date Nessus is. Here there's another scanner specific for web applications. So let's configure our own scan. Click Advanced Scan. First, give a name for your policy. Now go to Discovery section. So we're in the Host Discovery page. Here we have a Ping the Remote Host option and the settings of the ping. If we're going to use the data we collected with Nmap, we can close this ping scan because we already have the lists of the hosts. Click Port Scanning to configure port scanning options. The default value of the port scan range is, well, default. That means Nessus will scan the ports, which is in its Nessus services file. Now I go to the terminal screen to analyze a Nessus services file. Let's find the file first. Use the find command to find the file. / means that the search will begin from the root directory. -name shows the name of the search file, and hit enter. And here it is. You can stop the search using Control-C keys. I use the less command to see the content of the file. Here are the ports, protocols, and the default services which use these ports. Now I want to see the number of the lines of Nessus services file to understand how many ports are scanned by default. Cat command with a file name, pipe, WC to see the word count. The first number is the number of lines, the second one is the number of the words, and the last one is the number of the characters. So we can say that 9,000 ports are scanned by default, which is the total of both TCP and UDP ports. But what if you want to see the number of TCP ports scanned by default? You can use grep before WC, type cat file name pipe grep TCP pipe WC. You will see the number of TCP ports scanned by default. There are about 4,600 TCP ports. Now if you want to scan for all ports, you should type 1 through 65535 in port scan range field. So here are the options to use SSH service for local port enumerators. So let's have a short break here. If you have some credentials to scan some services in depth, you can define those credentials before the scan. So here, select the Credentials tab, and you see some services. When you click the SSH, for example, you will see the credential options. But let's remove this for now. Now turn back to Settings by clicking its tab. We were in Discovery Port Scanning page, and here are the port scanning options. SynScan is selected by default. If you like, you can select TCP and or UDP scans as well. Now go to the Advanced section. Safe checks are enabled by default. So we can select scan IP addresses in a random order to make the scan a little more stealthy. Let's look at the performance options. We can reduce the number of max simultaneous hosts per scan to avoid delays in network traffic. Max number of concurrent TCP sessions per host is not defined by default. We can define an upper bound to keep the hosts safe. And again, we may define a maximum number of concurrent TCP sessions per scan to keep the network traffic safe. Now look at the tabs on the top of the new policy page and you'll see the plugins tab. Right, so here we have tons of plugins used in Nessus scans. If you click one of the plugin families, you'll see all the plugins of that family. You see the total number of plugins in a plugin family, and here are the plugins. You can click on Enabled next to a plugin to disable it. Or if you want to disable an entire plugin family entirely, for example, denial of service, click on Enable label next to the name of the plugin family. Click Save, and now we have our own scan policy. At last, we are ready to start a Nessus vulnerability scan. This is the main page of the Nessus web interface. We are in My Scan section of Scans tab. At the upper left corner, click New Scan. First, Nessus asks for the scanner. We have seen them before, so here we can choose the most suitable one for our scan. But in the home version of Nessus, unfortunately, some scans are disabled. If you click Internal PCI Network Scan, for example, the application redirects you to the Nessus website to buy Nessus Professional. There are also available scanners like Basic Network Scan, or alternatively, go to User Defined tab and select your own policy. This is the policy we defined in the previous lecture, so I chose this. Now, give a name to your scan. As you can see in the right side of the name field, the required fields are identified by Nessus. So write a description if you want. Select the folder for the outputs, and define the targets. You can list the hosts in Targets field one by one. I want to scan my two systems now. 99.139 is OWASP BWA, and 99.206 is my Metasploitable system. So if you want multiple IP addresses, just put a comma in between them. You can also define an IP block or a range, just as you remember in the Nmap lectures. Or alternatively, if you have a file that contains a list of the hosts that we also covered earlier, you can add that file using the Add File link in the Upload Targets field. So now we're ready to launch the scan. At the bottom of the page, select Save, or click the down arrow button and select Launch to start the scan immediately. I choose Launch. It first saved the scan and then launched immediately. So while it's scanning, let's see some of the parts of Nessus interface. At the left, you see the folders. Next to My Scans folder, it says that I have one active scan. And in My Scans page, you see the scan that we just started. If you click on it, you see the scan details. There are 3 tabs here: Hosts, Vulnerabilities, and History. When you click on the Vulnerabilities tab, you see the vulnerabilities found during the scan. Here, we already have some results. Now click the Hosts tab to turn back. These are the systems that we defined as targets: OWASP BWA and Metasploitable. At the right, you see the severity levels of the vulnerabilities. Nessus classifies vulnerabilities into 5 levels. Informational level quickly identifies non-vulnerability information, which is, well, nice to know, and separates them from the vulnerability detail, which is need to know, right? Low level identifies the flaws that might help an attacker to better refine his attack, but by itself that flaw won't be sufficient for a compromise. Medium level identifies that some information is leaking from the remote host. An attacker might be able to read a file he should not have access to. High level identifies that the attacker can read arbitrary files on the remote host and or can execute commands on it. And critical level vulnerabilities are the most important vulnerabilities for us. These vulnerabilities can be exploited by a tool, and in most cases, the attacker does not need to make an extra effort to exploit them. So let's fast forward the scan. Now, on the right side of each host row, you can see the status of the scan of that host. 100% means the scan of that host is complete. Did you know you can ping the hosts sometimes to understand that they're still alive? And finally, our scan is completed in 4 minutes, which is a very fast scan for a vulnerability scan. Now let's click the Metasploitable to go to the vulnerabilities of that host. Here are the vulnerabilities of the Metasploitable machine found by this scan. Please note that there might be other vulnerabilities that cannot be found by Nessus with the policy that we used. The vulnerabilities are ordered by severity levels by default, and I think that's a good idea. The vulnerabilities in the critical severity level are the most important ones for us again. So click on a vulnerability to see the details of it. So here we have the name of the vulnerability, a brief description, a solution method, and the links to learn more about it, and last, the host and the port where the vulnerability lives. At the right side of the screen, you see some additional and important information about the vulnerability. So for this particular vulnerability, Nessus says that we can exploit it using Core Impact, which is a commercial and very powerful exploitation tool. And here are the scores of this vulnerability. 10.0 is perfect for us. So click Back to Vulnerabilities to go back to the list of the vulnerabilities. Here there is another vulnerability which says the VNC server is running on the host and its password is password. If that's true, and if there's no additional measure to protect the host, we can access that host very easily. I'll show you. Let's test it. Go to the terminal screen and run the VNC viewer by typing xVNC viewer and hit enter. If you don't have VNC viewer installed on your Kali, type apt-get install xVNC viewer and hit enter. Type the IP address of Metasploitable as the VNC server and hit enter. And now type password as the password and hit enter again. And voila, we are in the system. I use the womi Linux command to learn the user that I've caught, and uname-a to learn the operating system and the kernel details. Ifconfig to see the information about the network interfaces, etc. Now type rm-rf/. No, just kidding, don't do that, don't. And finally, let's see the reporting abilities of Nessus. Open a browser and go to Nessus service, HTTPS, localhost, and port 8834. Log in with your credential. And here are the scans we performed before. I've only one for now, but click on it and see the details. In the upper right-hand corner, there's an export combo box. When you click on it, you see the report types of Nessus Home. So let's generate a PDF report first. We have two options in the Home Edition, and you'll have other options if you buy the Professional Edition. So I choose Custom here, and as you see, we have only two options in Home Edition. You can group the vulnerabilities by host or plugin. I choose the host. And click Export to generate the report in PDF format. Save it or open it now. I'll choose Open, and that way you can see it. So the file is downloaded into the temp folder. And here's a scan report in PDF format. Vulnerabilities are grouped by hosts. I'll click the Metasploitable header. Now there's a few lines of brief summary, then the explanation of the vulnerabilities start. As you see, the vulnerabilities are not sorted by the severity level, which is not good. Of course, you can sort them in the Professional Edition. That's where they get you. So now let's see the Vulnerability Assessment Report in HTML format. Same home page with the PDF option. This time I'll choose the Executive Summary option and click Export. Open it with Firefox. And here's the report in HTML format. A single frame for each host. Click the Show Details button to see the vulnerabilities list of the host. If you want to have detailed information about a vulnerability, Click on it. The HTML file redirects you to the online web pages of Tenable Security. And now, my friends, it's lab time. It's just a jump to the left. All right. Please try to perform these steps in your lab environment. First, go to your Nessus web interface. Create a new scan policy. See and modify the options as much as you can. Choose destinations. Try to give a text file as the destination hosts list. Start the scan and analyze the results. So you've made it to the end of the course. But before you run out testing every single network you can find, let's remember what we learned in this course. Firstly, we learned how to prepare the lab environment, how to download and set up Metasploitable 2 to compromise. Scan types, passive scans, and active scans. Perform some passive scans using Wireshark and ARP tables. The fundamentals of the TCP/IP family with the basics of TCP and UDP protocols. Active scan in detail using Nmap. The most important Nmap scan types. No port scan, also known as, say it with me, ping scan. SYN scan, TCP scan, and UDP scan. Comparison of the SYN scan and the TCP scan. What about the details of port scanning? We also learned about the service and the version detection and why that's important, and how to detect the operating system of a host, the details of input and output management in Nmap, Nmap scripting engine, or NSE, performing script scans, some important scripts, and timing in Nmap scans. We also learned about bypassing IDS and IPS devices. And remember some of the other Nmap scans? Null scan, fin scan, Christmas scan, ACK scan, idle scan. We also went into the definition of vulnerability. And then, scanning vulnerabilities with Nessus. We went over how to download, install, and run Nessus on Kali, and how to perform a Nessus vulnerability scan and export the result reports. And that about does it for me. I really hope you enjoy the course, and I hope to see you in another cybersecurity course. Till then, stay safe, my friends. Let's perform another vulnerability scan. I want to perform an aggressive scan to find as many vulnerabilities as possible. Go to Kali and start the Nessus daemon if it's not already started. Use service Nessus D status to learn if it's running. Okay, so it's inactive. So I use service Nessus D start to start Nessus service. Now, go to your browser and connect to the Nessus interface. It is a HTTPS service. It's running on the same machine, so I'll use 127.0.0.1 loopback IP address referred to as localhost, and the port of the Nessus service is 8834. Sign in using your credential. Click the New Scan button. Now let's choose Advanced Scan for this scan. Will be more aggressive than a basic network scan. So enter the basic info, give the scan a name, and enter a description if you want. And the targets. Here I have a Windows XP with an IP address of 207 and Metasploitable 2 Linux system with an IP address of 206. Here I have a third system, an up-to-date Windows 8, and its IP address is 223. Right, so back to Kali and enter the IP addresses of the target systems. 206 for Metasploitable, 207 for Windows XP, and 223 for Windows 8. Now click Discovery in the list at the left. So we're simply going to accept the defaults on this page. So let's click on Assessment over to the left. And on this page, we want to check Perform Thorough Tests, so check the box. Then move to the Report section in the options on the left. You can override the normal verbosity to make it report as much info as possible. So next, click the Advanced option in the list to the left. The only thing we're going to do here is uncheck Enable Safe Checks. Now, on a normal production network, you would leave this box checked. You don't want to take down production systems when scanning. But for our purposes here, we want to gather as much information as possible, so we're going to uncheck it. Now click on the Credentials tab. Select the SSH option in the list on the left. Now, since we know the username and password for the Metasploitable 2 machine, we're going to put those credentials in here. Remember, the username and password are both MSF admin. Change the authentication method to password and put in the username and password below. Now, in the Plugins tab, we only need to activate the plugins that have to do with what might be running on a Linux system, so we can disable a few things here. Okay, I paused the demo here. I've got to make an apology. It's a late update. While capturing the demo, I forgot that I have Windows targets and disabled the Windows plugins. It's a mistake, and I just wanted to show you that what we do here is, if there's a problem, there's always a solution. So if you have Windows targets, please do not disable the Windows plugins. All right, let's move on. We can finally click Save at the bottom. So here's the scan, and we're ready to run it. Simply click the great triangle at the far right of our scan, which stands for launching the scan. And yes, the scan is started. Now you can pause or stop the scan anytime you want. So click the scan, and we see the results in real time. Okay, boy, that's going to take a while to run, so it's probably a good time to check your email, grab a cup of coffee maybe, but just make sure you come back to review the results. So the scan is completed in 17 minutes. Now another pause here. Because I disabled the Windows plugins, it seems as if the Windows systems don't have critical vulnerabilities. It's not right, especially my Windows XP has several critical vulnerabilities. If you didn't disable Windows plugins, you're supposed to see some more vulnerabilities for Windows systems. Now, to see the results of the Metasploitable scan in detail, let's click the Metasploitable Results 206. The Nessus Home found 10 critical vulnerabilities with our scan configuration. But please note that the configuration affects the results, so the target systems may have more vulnerabilities than reported. If there is a vulnerability and it's not found in a scan, we call it a false negative. Now, I'm sure you know that the critical vulnerabilities are the most dangerous ones, but that's where it gets good. They are the most exploitable ones in general. So let's click on one of these critical vulnerabilities, for example, bind shell backdoor detection. Well, look at the description. It says a shell is listening on the port without any authentication being required. This is obviously a backdoor. Here's a port number, 1524. Now, let's check if the finding is a true positive. Go to terminal screen. I use Netcat tool to connect. Simply type NC and the target IP and the target port 1524. And we're in. We have the shell for Metasploitable. Type who am I to learn the credential we have. We are the root user. Now, it was too simple. It's just not fun. And, I don't like it. I like a good challenge, right? I mean, we are the root user, and we can access anything we want. For example, shadow file, which contains the hashes of the user's passwords. Okay, back to the browser and click on the Back to Vulnerabilities link to turn back to the vulnerabilities of Metasploitable. Now I'd like to show you some more. Scroll on down the vulnerabilities. It shows 50 vulnerabilities per page by default, but let's make it 200 to see all the findings in a single page. Now, the findings are ordered by severity levels, so information is at the bottom. Findings with a severity level of information identify non-vulnerability information, which is, nice to know, and it keeps it separate from the vulnerability detail. So here there's an info RMI registry detection. Let's click it. It says that the remote host is running an RMI registry, retrieving remote objects in the Java runtime method invocation system. So let's look for the exploits of the Metasploit framework, if there is any exploit for Java RMI. Open a terminal screen and run MSF console. So here we have MSF console. And let's search the exploits of RMI. Too many results. To keep it more specific, I want to search Java RMI. So we have 2 auxiliaries and 2 exploits at this time. So look at the exploit in the last line. This module takes advantage of the default configuration of the RMI registry and RMI activation services, which allow loading classes from any remote URL. Let's try to use it on our RMI port. Please don't worry, I am going to explain what these all mean. I just want to show you an example at the beginning, so bear with me. Type use at the module name with the full path. You can simply select the module name and click the middle button of the mouse to copy and paste it. Type show payloads to see the payloads can be used with this module. So I want to use this payload to have a meterpreter session. Again, don't worry, I'll explain what the meterpreter is soon, but just copy and paste the payload name. Type show options to see the parameters of the exploit and the payload as well. Set the remote host as Metasploitable 206. Default remote port is the same with our port, 1099. Serve host is the local host to listen on. Set this to be our Kali 222. Let the default serve port remain. So the other options are not required. I'll just leave them blank. Now are the payload options. Set the listen host to be our Kali 222. Default listen port is good, 4444. And finally type exploit to run the exploit. So there, it looks like we have a meterpreter session. Type sessions-L to list the active sessions. Be patient, we'll see them in detail. Type session-I, session ID, to interact with the session. And here we are, we're in. Now I'm going to show you what we can do with a meterpreter session in the following chapter. But here's a couple of meterpreter commands. sysinfo to see the system information. Hashdump to gather password hashes. Now, no such command for this system. Thankfully, we have an alternative for this. Type runpost/linux/gather/hashdump and hit enter. And collect the fruits of your labor. So, as you see here, we found another way to exploit the system, even though the finding was just information. So, I hope you understand not to underestimate any finding. Okay, everybody, I admitted I made a mistake in a previous scan, and I disabled the Windows plugins, although 2 of my 3 targets are Windows. It's just a really big mistake that affects the results, so that clearly shows that we should be very careful while configuring the tools, such as a vulnerability scanner. Now, I scanned the target machines once again, and I didn't disable the Windows plugins this time. So these are the results. 207 is Windows XP, and 223 is Windows 8. I click on the Windows XP to see the vulnerabilities. And as you see, there are a lot of critical vulnerabilities. I'll click on one of them just to see its details. So here is the name and the description about the vulnerability. And scrolling down, yes, it says the vulnerability is exploitable with Metasploit. Let's go back to vulnerabilities. I want to show you another vulnerability for our XP system. This is the vulnerability MS08-067, which has a very stable exploit. Rolling down a bit, and Nessus says we can exploit this vulnerability using Metasploit. So let's do it. I think it's an invitation. Open a terminal screen and start MSF console. Search for the vulnerability MS08-067. Here's the exploit. Let's use it. Look for the available payloads using Show Payloads. I want to use shell payload with bind TCP stager for this time. Show options. Set the remote host that was, well, let me look at the Nessus page again. Yes, 2007. And the port is 445. The default value is correct. Show the options again, and we're ready to run the exploit. Here is the shell of the target system. Exploitation is successful once again.